From a young age, we learn that some inheritances are invisible. They don't come in the form of wills or material possessions, yet they shape our destinies with the same force. Sometimes, even before we understand who we are, a path is already laid out for us. For some, the weight of their family's history rests heavily on their shoulders, making escape anything but simple. No matter how hard they try, the past always finds a way to call them back. Good evening, Dom. I always believed my life was written before I was even born, but it wasn't until I tried to escape it that I understood the true cost of choice. From the moment I came into this world, I had no say in the direction my life would take. It was all predetermined. My name, Ramiro Salazar, carries a legacy that began long before I existed. My grandparents, Emiliano and Donna Vanya, were highly respected figures in our community, known as healers and spiritual guides. My father, Benjamin, took their legacy even further. People called him the Saint of the People for the precision of his spiritual work, which never failed. Our home was modest, but it carried an energy I only came to understand much later. In the back, there was an altar, a space shrouded in mystery and faith. Its walls were adorned with symbols and figures that, as a child, seemed like meaningless scribbles. Later, I realized they were the foundation of everything we were. The air was always filled with the scent of burning copal and fresh herbs, a fragrance that clung to our clothes, a constant reminder of our essence. While other children played in the streets or kicked a ball, I spent hours in silence, watching the people who came to the altar. They arrived burdened with anguish, often in tears, and left transformed, some relieved, others with a peace that seemed impossible to explain. My grandmother said it was the work of the saint's grace, but I didn't understand. To me, it was just a curiosity. One afternoon, as we prepared an offering, she looked at me with an intense gaze and in a calm but firm voice declared, "You have the gift, Ramiro. The saints will call you, and you won't be able to refuse." Those words left me frozen. I didn't want to follow in my father's footsteps. It wasn't a lack of admiration, but fear. Fear of failing, of carrying that silent burden. My first inexplicable experience happened when I was 11. It was a night of celebration at the altar. The drums vibrated so intensely, it felt like my chest was pounding along with them. The chants mixed with the copal smoke, making the air thick, almost charged with something indescribable. I was helping my father when suddenly I felt a weight on my shoulders. My legs gave out and I fell to my knees. It wasn't pain. It was as if everything around me disappeared. When I came to, everyone was staring at me differently. Some looked surprised, others reverent. My father, with his usual serious expression, placed a hand on my shoulder and said I had received Santiago, the patron saint of our village. That was the moment I understood what it meant to have the gift. In my family's tradition, being a horse meant allowing spiritual entities to use your body to carry out their will. My voice would change, my hands would tremble, and my mind would be transported to an indescribable place. From that day on, I was no longer just Benjamin's son. I had become part of this story. Though I saw pride in my father's and grandmother's eyes, a part of me rebelled. What they saw as a blessing felt like a weight I never asked to carry. Over the years, I began my training. My father taught me every prayer, ritual, and the significance of each element. The candles, the flowers, the drinks, everything had a specific purpose. By 15, I was conducting small ceremonies. Each entity transformed the space uniquely. With Santa Anna, the atmosphere felt light and almost joyful, while with San Balthazar, my body felt crushed by an invisible weight. When I turned 18, my name began to spread. People from other places came seeking help at the altar. Some brought genuine problems, others dark desires that left me uneasy. I followed my father's teachings faithfully, respect and dedication above all, until one day everything changed. It was a stifling afternoon when a woman arrived. From the start, she seemed different. Well-dressed, wearing expensive perfume, but her eyes were empty, cold, as if there was no life behind them. Without hesitation, she asked me to perform a binding spell. She wanted a married man. It went against everything my father had taught me. "We don't do that kind of work here," I replied, trying to stay composed. Unfazed, she pulled out a stack of money I could never have imagined seeing in my life. The offer was enough to change our reality. My father always said faith and honesty were priceless, but in that moment I faltered. Something in her gaze disarmed me completely. I don't know how or why, but I accepted. I asked for the necessary materials, and she left the money on the table before walking out. As soon as she was gone, our home, once vibrant with energy, plunged into a silence that chilled my soul. I began the preparations in the following days. Red candles, offerings, prayers. Everything had to be perfect, but from the start, things felt off. The altar seemed to reject every gesture. The candles barely stayed lit, and the air grew heavy, suffocating. For several nights, I tried to call the entities, but none responded. When the woman returned, impatient, I didn't know what to say. "I need more time," I murmured, trying to calm her. She responded with a dry laugh that echoed in my mind long after she left. That night, the silence of the altar was broken by strange noises, almost impossible to describe. The floor seemed to vibrate, and I felt something invisible watching me. It was then I realized I had crossed a line I never should have. For the first time, I felt true fear. The altar, once a sacred refuge, now felt distant and hostile. The candles burned weakly, almost going out, and the symbols I had drawn on the floor looked distorted, as if someone had altered them. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just my imagination, but deep down I knew something was terribly wrong. When she returned for the third time, her presence was even more oppressive. Her face was tense and her gaze felt like a blade. Any excuse I tried to offer fell flat. I explained I had done everything I knew, but the saints simply wouldn't respond. The cold, ironic smile that appeared on her lips made it clear my hesitation wouldn't be tolerated. "Fix this soon, or I'll take matters into my own hands," she said before leaving, her bitter perfume lingering in the air, turning my stomach. That night, I decided to try again. I prepared everything with even greater care, arranged the candles, spread the copal, positioned the offerings, and marked the points precisely. Every detail was checked, nothing left to chance. I called on the entities with all the strength in my voice, but the altar remained silent. No sign, no presence. The silence was so heavy it felt like a deafening sound pressing on my ears. As I knelt before the altar, a noise behind me made me turn abruptly. The air was still, but something in the shadows seemed to move. A chill ran down my spine. For the first time, I wondered if what I was doing was truly safe. My father used to say faith brought protection from the saints, but in that moment, that protection seemed to have vanished. On the fourth day, the unexpected happened. It was already midnight when I was awakened by a muffled sound coming from the altar. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously walked to the backyard. When I arrived, I was stunned. The markings I had drawn were smudged as if something had trampled them. The candles I had extinguished earlier were lit again, but their flames were blue, weak, and gave off no heat. I froze, feeling an invisible presence around me. Something was there, I was sure of it, even if my eyes couldn't see it. Inside me, a voice repeated my father's words. "If something goes wrong, the fault is yours, not the saints." But it was too late to turn back. That same night, I had a dream that felt more real than anything I had ever experienced. I was at the altar, surrounded by shadows, whispering my name in low, almost inhuman tones. I felt invisible hands pulling me, dragging me toward a dark, unknown place. I woke up in a panic, overcome by the urgency to talk to my father. I didn't expect him to fix the problem, but I needed to know if he had ever faced something like this. I found him at the altar, his expression serious. I recounted every detail of what had been happening, but he barely looked up. When I finished, he set his coffee cup down and without emotion declared, "You crossed a line. Now the weight is entirely yours." His words hit me like a punch. I waited for some kind of comfort, but he just got up and left without another word. That indifference hurt more than any reprimand. I stayed there, feeling like everything around me was crumbling. That night, the noises returned, louder than ever. Shadows danced through the hallways, and the feeling of being watched gave me no rest. The following days were even worse. Clients who had once been respectful began returning, angry. Many complained that the work I had done hadn't worked, and that their lives had gotten worse. Some demanded I undo what had been done, as if I had any control over something that had already slipped completely from my hands. One night, as I tried to sleep, I heard a loud crash from the altar. I ran there and found the candles lit again, the floor covered in marks I had never seen before. It was as if something invisible was taunting me, showing me I had lost all control over the situation. When I thought I couldn't take any more, a man appeared at the altar. He was a stranger, dressed simply, carrying a small Bible. He said God had sent him to warn me that something dark was following me. At first, his words irritated me deeply. "We don't need sermons here," I replied, trying to push him away. But his gaze pierced through my defenses, as if he knew something I was trying to ignore. His words echoed within me. "They want your life, but God is giving you a chance." No matter how hard I tried to forget, every strange sound in the house and every moving shadow made me question everything. The reality was inescapable. I was losing control. The saints no longer answered me. Clients avoided me, and even my family began to look at me with disappointment. The loneliness and darkness around me seemed to grow without end. After the man with the Bible visited, the days that followed felt endless. Everything at the altar went wrong. The entities remained silent. The candles mysteriously went out, and the feeling of being watched became unbearable. I didn't know how to give up, even when the thought became constant. I had crossed a line I didn't fully understand, and the consequences were now in my hands. One night, as I tried to sleep, a repetitive sound from the backyard woke me. It was as if something heavy was hitting the ground. I grabbed my flashlight despite my racing heart and went to the altar. When I arrived, my blood ran cold. The markings I had drawn were undone, messy as if someone had trampled them repeatedly. The candles I had extinguished hours earlier flickered with an unstable flame, as if the air itself was vibrating. Fear paralyzed me. I felt something watching me from the shadows, a heavy, icy presence that made my entire body feel insignificant. My instinct was to retreat. I slowly went back to my room, closed the door, and spent the night wide awake, shuddering at every noise, convinced something was hunting me. In desperation, I decided to try one last ritual. It was my attempt to restore balance and prove to myself I still had some control over the situation. I organized every detail with obsessive precision, but once again, everything failed. I called on the entities with all the strength in my voice, but the altar remained empty. The silence seemed to mock me, more terrifying than any sound I could imagine. In the days that followed, things spiraled further out of control. Objects moved on their own, lights flickered without explanation, and the air inside the house turned icy, even under the intense heat outside. Each night was a worse nightmare than the last. The banging at the altar grew louder and more constant. The shadows seemed faster and more alive, and the feeling of being watched followed me even outside the house. One night, at the edge of exhaustion, something happened that surpassed all the previous horrors. As I tried to sleep, I felt something touch me. I opened my eyes and saw a dark figure at the foot of my bed, tall with a humanoid outline but undeniably unnatural. Sometimes the best solution is to let go of a property, land or building, especially if there are reports of strange phenomena linked to the place. Today we'll explore one such story that makes us question whether the efforts to erase these marks are effective, temporary, or permanent. Let's find out. A person from the United States who chose to remain anonymous shared the following account. I had an experience last year. I won't mention the city because it still worries me a lot. Someone who went through something similar might recognize me, and I don't want to risk my job. Still, I feel the need to share what happened. It was February of last year when my friend called me. Her youngest daughter had come down with a severe flu that turned into a serious infection, requiring constant care. I thought she was reaching out for direct help, so I immediately offered to assist in any way I could. But that wasn't exactly it. She needed someone to cover for her in the house cleaning business we ran together. We divided the work to support each other, so I agreed without hesitation. I even suggested giving her part of the payment to help with her daughter's medical expenses, since the job paid well. I rearranged my schedule to handle my usual commitments and take on her clients. Coincidentally, I left the last house, the one in question, for a Thursday evening due to availability. From the start, something about that place felt off. The clients we work for are usually wealthy, but this residence was undoubtedly one of the most impressive I'd ever seen. Still, I found it odd that they only wanted a few hours of service, as it would be impossible to clean a house that size in such a short time. Assuming they needed something specific, I went ahead with the job. My intuition was right. I was greeted by a man, I'll call him the butler, who told me what needed to be done. First, I had to pick up toys in the living room. Then he led me to a room upstairs. As we climbed, he explained that the family rarely used the house but hired him to stay there. It was a massive, silent house, and only the two of us were there that night. I quickly realized that the room hadn't been used in a long time. The butler needed an old key to open the door, and when I entered, I saw the space was covered in dust, but nothing that couldn't be cleaned. He warned me not to remove the covers, protecting the few pieces of furniture in the room, which was mostly empty. From what I could see, there was a long dresser and a large mirror leaning against the wall, a bit taller than me, but not too wide. He insisted I shouldn't uncover the furniture to avoid water or cleaning product damage. I went downstairs to get my supplies, and when I returned, I noticed several black stains scattered on the wall by the window facing the street. Only then did I realize he hadn't specified exactly what I was supposed to do in the room. Since it was almost empty, I assumed I just needed to dust and try to remove the stains. I looked around to call him and clarify, but he was already gone. I decided to proceed and started with the basics. Dusting. It was quick, and soon I moved on to the stains on the wall. I used the cleaning products he had provided, being careful not to damage the surfaces. However, those stains were peculiar. They seemed old, and the thin concrete wall painted a dark brown made the black marks stand out even more. For a moment I thought it might be mold or something caused by moisture, maybe a hidden leak or water damage. But as I rinsed the cloths in the bucket, I noticed something strange. The water turned red. I was suspicious because the cleaning product was clear. Immediately I thought the wall's paint might be bleeding, but when I looked at it, the color didn't seem faded. On the contrary, the stains were disappearing and the wall looked renewed. I kept cleaning, but the water in the bucket grew darker, taking on a deep red hue. The smell coming from it was also unusual, nothing like ordinary dirt. I tried not to think too much about what it could be, but the feeling that something was wrong bothered me. While crouched down, I heard a sound like furniture being dragged inside the room. I turned quickly, thinking the butler had entered without me noticing. But the door was open, and the room was still empty. In the silence, I could hear the faint sound of a TV and his laughter coming from what seemed to be the kitchen. I decided I must have been mistaken. Before turning to grab my things, I noticed something that made me freeze. The sheet covering the mirror began to rise. Not as if the wind was moving it, but as if something underneath was lifting it slowly, like an invisible hand pulling it up. The sheet continued to rise until it fell completely. I had clearly seen what looked like a hand underneath, but at that moment my mind searched for an excuse. It must have been the wind, I thought, even though I knew that wasn't possible. I decided to approach the mirror to put the sheet back. I don't know what came over me. Everything was so obvious, but at that moment, I just wanted to deny what was happening before my eyes. When I got closer to the mirror, I swear on my life, my family, and my job, I clearly saw a man standing inside the room. Terror gripped me because I hadn't seen anyone enter. I turned around quickly, but no one was there. At that moment, the butler came running, visibly hurried. He stopped at the door and asked, almost breathlessly, why I had uncovered the mirror. Before I could answer, he took the sheet from my hand, covered the mirror again without even looking at the reflection, and as soon as the cloth was in place, he asked me to follow him out of the room immediately. I was completely lost, not understanding what was happening, but I followed him into the hallway. He stopped, still agitated, and said, "Miss, what did I say about not touching the covers?" I replied that I hadn't touched anything, that the sheet had simply fallen on its own. I thought about telling him what I had seen in the mirror, but noticing how nervous he was, I feared he'd think I was making it up or going crazy. Then he asked me another question. "Did you hear laughter in the house earlier?" I confirmed I had and was about to say I thought it was him, but at that moment, everything started to make sense. The butler went back into the room, collected the buckets and cleaning tools I'd used, left, locked the door, and led me to the patio. He was clearly shaken. "That laughter you heard," he began. "It wasn't me, it was one of the previous owners of this house, someone who lived here many years ago." As soon as I realized, I ran to the room. When I got there and saw the mirror uncovered, I knew what had happened. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know you didn't do it on purpose." I was already terrified, my mind spinning with everything that had happened. The reflection in the mirror, the red water, the sound of something moving. Before I could process it, he continued, "Your friend, Flor, didn't tell you anything about this room or why you were here today, did she?" I shook my head and he explained, "Don't worry, I'll tell you what's going on. You've done what you needed to do today, but maybe your friend Flor didn't say anything because she's known this family for a long time. It doesn't surprise me that she kept it a secret because it's a delicate matter. Years ago, something very complicated happened here, and the family asked that it not be discussed. I'll tell you something, and when you can, ask your friend. She'll confirm I'm not lying." I took a deep breath, trying to prepare myself for what was coming. He went on, "Before the family stopped living here, they lived with the father. The laughter you heard earlier was his. Many years ago, this man went through hard times, financial problems, conflicts at work, disputes with his family, his wife. Well, it's not for us to judge anyone, but one day he took a gun he had kept and, in that room where you were, took his own life. I'm sure you can imagine the state the walls were in." He paused briefly before concluding, "It was right there, in that exact spot, where they found his body." He was sitting in a chair leaning against the wall, and as unbelievable as it sounds, those stains you cleaned today keep reappearing from time to time, exactly in that place. The family no longer lives here. They don't have the courage to sell the house, but they also can't bring themselves to live in it again. The mirror, in particular, has never left that room. It witnessed what happened to the previous owner, and that's why we always keep it covered. Whenever we hear that laughter, we know the sheet has somehow fallen. No wind gets in there, but without explanation, the cloth ends up on the floor. We have to cover it again, always without looking at the reflection. The lady of the house never wanted to get rid of the mirror, but she also never wanted to live here again. She even remarried and wants nothing to do with this place. He continued, "The man who died here never found peace, and honestly, I don't think he ever will. Some say people who take their own lives don't find peace, that God rejects them, and so on. I don't know if I believe that, but what I do know is that he's still here. He leaves that room from time to time. These days I don't feel as much fear because I never stay in the house at night, but whenever I hear that distant laughter, I run to cover the mirror and do it without looking." I didn't know what to say. It all seemed so absurd, but at the same time I couldn't ignore what I'd seen and felt. I just wanted to leave. We went to the entrance hall, and as he paid me and thanked me for coming, we heard a sound from upstairs. Both of us looked up, alarmed. It was as if someone was knocking on the door of that room. Not hard knocks, but insistent, as if trying to open it. I took the money and left without hesitation. He let me go immediately, perhaps to avoid scaring me further. As soon as I got home, I called my friend, demanding an explanation. I asked why she hadn't warned me about the place. She confessed she didn't want to frighten me, and thought all I'd have to do was clean those stains, which were already unusual. But she assured me she hadn't expected anything else to happen. During the call, she confirmed everything the butler had told me. She said it was true. The family had been dealing with this cycle for years. The mirror seemed to be some kind of portal to the memories of that man. Every so often it all started again. The stains returned, the laughter was heard, and in some cases even the knocks on the door could be heard. It was as if the father, trapped in that moment of his life, kept reliving his tragic end over and over. Some events seemed to get stuck in time, repeating in a continuous cycle. It's easy to think that only those who have passed away could cause these manifestations, but often, physical objects, like the mirror in this case, can also become part of the loop. Have you ever experienced something similar? Do you believe these events are echoes of the past, something tied to the paranormal, or simply coincidences that defy explanation? Before we move on to the final story, if you're still here, let me know what time you're watching. I'd like to know who's tuning in. The road cutting through to the center felt like a dark corridor, shrouded by a dull, starless sky. The constant hum of the engine and the whisper of wind slipping through the cracked windows of my truck were my only companions. It was well past midnight, and I needed to deliver a load of fruit to the Toluca market before dawn. Though I'd driven this route countless times, something about that night felt off. I can't quite explain it, but ever since I left the last gas station, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. At first, it was just an uneasy premonition, like something was lurking just beyond my line of sight. But after a while, I noticed a light. It was tiny at first, a small spark on the horizon. For a moment, I thought it might be a plane or a helicopter, but its movements made no sense. The light hovered in a straight line, then suddenly made impossible turns, almost like a malfunctioning drone. That's the explanation I clung to, even though nothing about it felt natural. I pressed the accelerator, trying to ignore it, but the light stayed with me, keeping pace on my right side, gliding over the dark fields as if it wanted to accompany me. I forced myself to believe it was just a farmer using a drone to monitor his land, but the idea of someone being out there in the middle of nowhere at that hour didn't make sense. The unease grew heavier in my chest, and I turned on the radio, hoping to drown out the bad thoughts. But all I heard was static, and that sent chills down my spine. That electric silence was something I'd never experienced before, not in all the times I'd driven this route. Then the light changed color. It went from a dull white to an intense yellow, almost like a vibrant flame, and it started moving closer. Every time I glanced in the truck's mirrors, I saw the light darting from side to side, toying with me like a predator playing with its prey. Cold sweat dripped down my back as I struggled to breathe, my fingers gripping the steering wheel. I thought about stopping, but something deep inside begged me not to. Suddenly, the light left the fields and positioned itself directly in front of me, in the middle of the highway, about 100 meters away. I slowed down, trying to stay calm, and finally got a clear look at the shape behind the glow. It was a perfectly round sphere, floating just above the ground. Its surface seemed to pulse, almost as if it were alive, leaving me breathless. But what really shook me were the shadows moving inside it. I can't describe it well, but they looked like humanoid figures, hazy silhouettes staring at me from within the sphere, surrounded by flickering blue lights. The entire truck began to tremble. The engine struggled to keep running, and the dashboard lights flickered before going out completely. In seconds, I was enveloped in darkness, with only the glowing sphere in front of me. That's when I heard a strange sound, not from the engine or the wind outside. It was a deep, dense hum like the noise of a swarm, but with a depth that made my head throb. I covered my ears, trying to block out the unbearable noise, but it was useless. The sound seemed to invade every corner of my mind, as if it wanted to tear apart my thoughts. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the light vanished. There was no transition, no gradual fading. It was like someone flipped a switch, plunging everything into silent darkness. The engine came back to life abruptly, and the truck's lights flickered before stabilizing. My hands shook on the wheel, and I didn't dare move a muscle. What I had just witnessed was inexplicable, and I knew it was far from ordinary. I took a deep breath, pressed the accelerator, and continued driving, praying it wouldn't happen again. But deep down I felt it wasn't over. After that night, nothing felt normal. I drove to my destination with my nerves on edge, constantly checking the rearview mirrors as if expecting the lights to reappear. But nothing happened. When I finally unloaded the cargo, I tried to focus on work, forcing myself to ignore the unsettling feeling that something was still wrong. It was a persistent sensation, almost physical, like someone was watching me from a place I couldn't see. That silent presence followed me to the motel, where I decided to rest before heading back. In the parking lot, as I locked up the truck and washed my face, I noticed something strange on the windshield. There were small marks, perfectly round circles as if drawn with some kind of sophisticated tool. My heart raced as I got closer to inspect them. I ran my fingers over the marks, but they had no texture, as if they were embedded in the glass in a way that couldn't be removed. The circles had a pattern, almost like an intentional design, but its meaning escaped me. What the hell is this? I muttered to myself, unsure what to think. I tried to rationalize it, imagining it might be some weather effect or even a prank. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something very unusual was happening. I grabbed a damp cloth to clean the windshield, but the marks didn't budge. Frustrated, I decided to ignore it and went to my room. I turned on the TV, cranking up the volume to drown out my disturbing thoughts. Despite that, my night was terrible, filled with confusing dreams where lights and strange shapes chased me. The next morning, I hit the road again, but I felt physically ill. It was like I had a fever and the anxiety was unbearable. All I wanted was to put an end to this sequence of bizarre events, yet the feeling of being followed persisted. No matter how much I checked the mirrors, there was nothing there, but the discomfort remained. Even the sound of the engine seemed different, as if it were under some invisible strain, carrying a weight I couldn't see. Things got worse when I stopped at a deserted rest area. I got out of the truck to stretch and light a cigarette, but something on the ground caught my attention. Footprints. They weren't from tires or boots, they were something completely different. The marks were elongated, with deep grooves and what looked like splayed fingers. My breathing quickened as I followed the trail with my eyes. The footprints circled the truck and led toward a nearby forest, disappearing among the trees. I couldn't resist following them. It was daytime, and the sunlight gave me a false sense of courage to venture into the woods. Each step I took felt like a mix of bravery and recklessness, as if something bigger than me was pushing me forward. I knew I should have left it alone, but the feeling of being watched by something invisible was overwhelming. The forest was eerily silent. No crickets, no birdsong, just the dry snap of branches under my boots. The marks continued ahead, and soon I noticed more strangeness around me. Some areas of the vegetation were scorched, dark patches scattered on the ground, as if an intense heat had passed through. Then, in the middle of a small clearing hidden among the trees, I saw it, something that didn't belong to this world. A metallic structure, modest in size but with an imposing presence, floated a few inches above the ground. Its surface glowed with a soft pulsating light, almost as if it were alive. It made no sound, but the air around it felt denser, almost suffocating. My heart felt like it was trying to escape my chest. Part of me screamed to run back to the truck, but my legs wouldn't move. Curiosity kept me rooted there, watching. Holding the flashlight that trembled in my hands, I approached slowly, and that's when I noticed something even more unsettling. On the ground around the object, symbols were etched, similar to the ones I'd seen on the truck's windshield, but much larger, with intricate patterns. Before I could process what I was seeing, The structure emitted a low hum, followed by an intense light that forced me to close my eyes. A strange heat washed over my skin, as if I were being analyzed. When I finally opened my eyes, the structure was gone. The clearing was empty, leaving only the marks on the ground and a silence that seemed to press against my ears. A sudden sound behind me made me jump. It was like the noise of a deflating balloon, but there was nothing there. Still, the feeling of being watched became unbearable. I ran out of the forest without looking back. When I reached the truck, I started the engine as fast as I could and didn't stop until I reached the next town. That night, as I stared at the symbols on the windshield and replayed what I'd seen in the woods, I came to an inevitable conclusion. Something was following me, something not of this world, and for some reason, it had turned its attention to me. The scariest part was not knowing if it would appear again or if it would find me first. The days that followed brought no relief. It was as if my life had turned into a continuous wait, a constant state of alert, as if something could happen at any moment. Even as I tried to go about my routine as a truck driver, everything felt different, out of place. The road felt heavier, the sounds louder, and the silences deeper. Even the gas stations where I usually stopped, which once gave me a sense of security, now filled me with discomfort. One night, as I drove north toward San Luis, the familiar pressure returned. It was as if the air around me had grown denser, like someone was holding their breath beside me. I checked the mirrors, but this time there were no lights. Still, something about the environment felt wrong, out of sync. I turned on the radio to ease my anxiety, but all I found was static. The continuous hum invaded my mind, as if it wanted to spread my unease even deeper. That's when I realized I wasn't alone. A faint reflection in the rearview mirror caught my attention. It wasn't the frantic light I'd seen before, but something subtler, almost delicate, a faint glow, like a distant fire flickering without visible flames. I tried to ignore it, convinced it was just my exhausted mind playing tricks on me, but as I drove on, it became clear the glow wasn't random. It seemed to follow my path, moving among the shadows of the trees, appearing and disappearing as if it were toying with me. Even with my heart racing, something told me not to stop. I changed my route, taking a little used dirt road that led to a village where I hoped to find refuge. There was a gas station and a small diner there, but as I drove, the environment began to change in subtle, unsettling ways. The trees seemed to grow taller, their canopies closing over the sky above me, and the shadows around me became denser, almost solid. The truck's engine began to sputter, as if struggling against something invisible. I knew it wouldn't hold out much longer, and then, finally, it died. I was stuck there, surrounded by a darkness that seemed to have a will of its own, almost tangible. I got out of the truck, trying to control the fear pounding in my chest, and lifted the hood. At first glance, everything seemed normal, but the smell, a strong, disconcerting odor, filled the air. It was a mix of metal and something burning, something I couldn't identify. It was like melted plastic combined with hot iron, creating a nauseating, unnatural scent. That's when I noticed the engraving on the passenger door. It wasn't just a scratch or accidental damage. It was a symbol, a circle crossed by curves that came together in a shape resembling a stylized eye. I touched the engraving with trembling fingers and felt a strange heat, almost alive, radiating from the mark, as if it had just been made. Before I could process it, the sound of footsteps snapped me out of my trance. They were slow, deliberate, and coming from the forest. I pointed my flashlight in the direction of the noise, but saw nothing. Still, the footsteps continued, circling me as if something were closing in. The air grew sharp, cold enough to make me shiver to the bone, and then a whisper, almost imperceptible but heavy, with a weight that froze me inside. Everything around me seemed different. The road I knew was gone, and I was in a place I didn't recognize, a clearing surrounded by giant trees whose canopies formed a dark, suffocating ceiling. In the center of that space, a light shone in the sky. It pulsed like a colossal heart and seemed focused solely on me, exposing me like prey under a predator's gaze. That's when something emerged from the darkness. It glided between the trees with fluid, unreal movements, as if the ground didn't exist. It was tall, almost disproportionate, and its long, thin limbs seemed to defy the logic of the body. Its skin was gray and dull, like wet ashes, and its eyes, those eyes were black voids like nothingness, yet somehow they reflected everything I feared, as if they had delved into the darkest parts of my soul and brought it all to the surface. My entire body froze. I tried to move, but it was as if my own will had been ripped away. The being tilted its head slightly, watching me almost with curiosity. Every detail of it screamed that it wasn't human. It made no sound, but then inexplicably I felt its presence in my mind. I can't describe how it happened, but it was as if it invaded thoughts I didn't even know I had, unraveling everything I was. I didn't hear words, but images and sensations flooded my mind, thoughts that weren't mine, inserted forcefully, dominating my consciousness. The pain was unbearable, a pressure that seemed to crush every fiber of my being. In a desperate effort, I screamed and somehow broke that connection. Staggering back, my body took over and I ran. I didn't know where I was going, it didn't matter. I just needed to escape. The trees around me seemed to come alive, their twisted branches reaching out as if trying to grab me. Behind me, the hum grew louder, a high-pitched sound that cut through my thoughts like a blade. Slender figures appeared and disappeared among the shadows surrounding me. My lungs burned and every step was an act of desperation, taking me further from any possibility of return. When I finally stopped, I was at the edge of a cliff. Below me was only a black, infinite void. I couldn't see the bottom. The hum was now deafening and the creatures were closing in. With no other way out, I screamed with everything I had left and jumped into the abyss. The fall seemed endless. For a moment, I believed my end was near, that I would soon feel the impact and it would all be over. But that never happened. It was as if I were falling into an endless void, surrounded by darkness until it finally swallowed me whole. When I woke up, I jolted upright in the truck seat. The engine was running smoothly, purring softly, and the familiar road stretched out ahead of me. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare, but my body told me otherwise. Every muscle ached as if I'd been running for hours and had fallen from an impossible height. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was 3:15 a.m., the same time everything had started. Something, however, didn't add up. My GPS was dead and the radio only emitted static. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts, and decided to keep driving to my destination. When I finally arrived, the startled looks from the workers made me even more uneasy. "Where have you been, Samuel?" the foreman asked, pale and incredulous. "What are you talking about?" I replied, still trying to make sense of what had happened. They explained that I had been missing for a week. The cargo never arrived and no one had heard from me. To them, I had been the victim of a robbery or something worse. My blood ran cold. To me, only a few hours had passed, but the calendar and the expressions on those men's faces didn't lie. That same night, I quit my job, went home, and locked myself inside, unable to face the outside world. For days, I tried to piece together what had happened, but I couldn't. Fragments of memory came in flashes. Lights, those creatures, the hum that seemed tattooed on the back of my mind. Even now, I don't feel truly safe. Sometimes the hum returns. It starts low, almost imperceptible, but soon fills every corner of the house. At night, I see tall, thin shadows moving in the yard, disappearing before I can fully look at them. The reflection of those black eyes appears in mirrors, windows, and even in the dreams I can't escape. I know it's not over. I feel it in the air, in the way the shadows seem longer than they should be in the nights I can't sleep. I'm waiting for the moment they'll return because I know they will. These entities, wherever they come from, don't forget. When they mark you, it's for a reason, and I'm proof of that. Maybe by the time you hear this, I won't be here anymore. Hey everyone, thanks for listening. Click the notification bell to be alerted to all future narrations. I upload new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I hope to see you in the next ones. Now on the screen, I'll leave 2 other great videos I know you'll enjoy. See you there.